I don't know how Oda does it, but he seems to more often than not make the absolute most out of every situation he places his characters within. Every scene, every encounter, and every single set piece serves the story and makes it all so incredibly interesting and fun to read through. After the heartbreaking, tension-filled excitement the last arc ended on, I was sort of anxious to see how the narrative was going to progress, but it just keeps getting better. From the vibrant vistas of Amazon Lily to the cramped corridors of Impel Down, the tension of the occasion mixed with the exemplary storytelling Oda flexes on chapter by chapter is a feast for the eyes and the mind. And in this video, I will be attempting to describe how unbelievably exciting and fantastic these arcs are. And so, without further ado, I'm totally not Mark, and these are my first impressions on, thoughts of, and review for the intensely interesting and masterfully composed Amazon Lily and Impel Down. So last week, it came to my attention that, I might have forgotten to mention a certain character. And yeah, I get it, he's important. Okay, so in my defense, I only just met him, and while he was revealed, yes, we also met this guy, and this happened. So I was a little preoccupied with stuff that was immediately happening, and more often than not, I couldn't care less about how a character looks or how flashy they really are, and in this case, the pun is absolutely intended. But you guys wanted me to say something, so here it is. The angry Admiral Man enters the chat while riding a cannonball, which is a cool visual reminiscent of Tao from Dragon Ball that I enjoyed. He did fight with the supernovas for a bit, but I have no idea how strong they are relative to each other, so I don't really learn much about him or them from that particular exchange. We learn about his Devil Fruit ability, which is pretty flashy, pun intended again. Both he and Aokiji seem to share a personality trait of being quite nonchalant, which does well to establish a certain confident presence. As for the supernovas, I don't have anything to say about them beyond what I already did in my last video. I get that people wanted me to talk about Kizaru and these guys more than I vaguely did in my last video, but the fact remains, at this point in the story, they are only just being introduced. If they become something significant in the future, I'll mention them then, but until such time they directly influence the story beyond showing up and fighting, I'll be sure to discuss them in more detail. I mean, for instance, when I met Blackbeard for the very first time, I almost didn't mention him in my script, and it's like that by design. Oda as a writer plants tons of seeds as he writes the One Piece story, and I recognize that Kizaru is an admiral and that the supernovas are significant, but while writing the video last week, I didn't have anything substantial to say about them beyond recapping the events. If certain characters don't impact the story enough or strike my fancy as much as I want them to, then I just won't talk about them, and it's nothing to do with the character, it's just that I don't have anything to say necessarily about them in that moment. But if they show up later, I will be sure to mention them then. Alright, let's go to the jungle. This brief but insightfully and delightfully compelling story arc surrounding Luffy was, I found, uniquely engaging, and once I finished what this arc had to offer, I was very impressed with what it did for the story. Not just because it exposes some very interesting and eye-opening lore that I will most definitely be discussing later in this video, but it also provided an emotionally rich patch of respite amidst this turbulent saga we currently find ourselves in, deciding to explore Luffy's emotional state, the whereabouts of the crew, and his ultimate plan to circumvent his predicaments, and to ultimately decide he needs to save his brother from his doomed fate first. For the first time since the very first chapters, Luffy is very much alone, having cultivated an endearing and loving crew of friends to surround himself with against all odds over the last 500 some odd chapters. This arc opens with Luffy flying through the air before landing deep in the jungle of Amazon Lily, a brand new island, completely isolated. Which, firstly, I would like to question the allegiance of Kuma as a warlord of the sea, or if he is in fact doing what he was told to do by sending him there. Maybe it's important for Luffy and the crew to remain alive, but to be very separate. But anyway, back to the story at hand. It's in these first opening chapters and challenges that Luffy is presented with on this unfamiliar island that we, or at least I, got a very different feeling while going through it. There's a sort of off-balance and desperate feeling that paints Luffy's every effort. And that's one of the strongest attributes this arc has working in its favor, its goal. This story, acts as an immediate continuation to the horrific events that took place in the archipelago a mere chapter ago, and follows Luffy as he tries to find and regroup with his crew with an incredibly lonely air to the occasion towards the beginning. And the notion of being able to regroup with his friends is made all the more possible due to one fantastic mechanic being brought back to light: the life papers in his possession. Radius points back towards the archipelago and Ace's directly towards his location in Impel Down. Right off the bat, we are made aware of the dilemma Luffy faces. Quite literally, he needs to choose which path to follow, and while initially it's obvious, as he at this point doesn't see the urgency to help out his brother Ace, but as the story progresses, it becomes abundantly clear that he can't follow the path that leads him back to his friends just yet, but instead needs to deal with his family. And it's down this path through both this arc, Amazon Lily, and Impel Down thereafter, that we begin learning more and more about Luffy's family and his past. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. In trying to formulate a plan in order to get back to civilization and ultimately the crew at the archipelago, we see Luffy incapacitate himself by eating the wrong sort of mushroom, leading him to be discovered by a group of women native to this island. They bring him back to their village thinking that he too was a woman. However, once they remove the last mushroom from his body, to their surprise, I'm not exactly sure if this is relevant here, but while I was learning about and being exposed to the culture and customs of this island's tribe, I noticed that their currency was Gol, G-O-L, which is the first time I noticed something having the same word or name as a key character. Maybe it has some significance moving forward regarding Gold D. Roger, but maybe it doesn't, I don't know, it's just money. As the story progresses, there's a fantastic piece of subtle character writing on display once Luffy regains consciousness within the tribe. The very first thing he asks about once he comes to is about his friends, and the second is his hat, subtly showing his personality traits and priorities as a character that I really enjoyed when I noticed it. However, once he wakes up in a confusion, he starts demanding information before breaking out, taking with him the very girl who replaced the clothes he was wearing with these new ones. These nice flowery new ones. Specifically, he takes her because she has the life paper he needs to find where he needs to go next, which is a beautiful means of interweaving the plot with the characters to force them into believable circumstances, allowing us the audience to learn more about this girl without it feeling forced. This arc works ridiculously well in that regard too. The motivations, decisions, and interactions that take place therein feel so perfect and real. And I think that's because there are so few things to keep track of in this arc when you compare it to all the rest, with Luffy for the most part being the only character that was known of before going into this. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that this would mean that this arc would feel like a sort of filler in a lot of aspects, but it really isn't, and I can't stress that enough. This is one of the best setup arcs in the entire series, and during these innocent interactions between Luffy and this girl, Luffy learns of Ace's fate, and she learns that Luffy isn't anyone to be scared of or wary of anymore. She informs Luffy of the location Ace now finds himself in, how the island they are on is within the Cam Belt surrounded by Neptunians, and that one of the only ways off the island is on a particular ship. This extravagant character becomes the focus of a chapter or two when a vice admiral that goes by the name of Momongo arrives to summon Hancock to Marineford. Apparently, all the warlords of the sea are expected to be on hand for Ace's execution, and those that do not attend will have their titles revoked. So, yeah, she's a warlord of the sea apparently, which is awesome, and her introduction in this scene is fittingly impactful, flat out refusing to fight in the impending war, and informs the vice admiral that not only will she keep her title and privileges, but she will also take his cargo and treasure, which, I mean, come on, it's a pretty metal move. Through this interaction, it's also revealed that she has the devil fruit ability to turn those that find her attractive to stone. The vice admiral prevents this from happening, however, by stabbing his own hand. Getting major Chad vibes from this dude, but gives her just 2 days, and after that, if she doesn't comply, her titles and position will be revoked. In the meantime, however, he will wait in the harbor. Essentially, for all intents and purposes, Boa Hancock is the leader of this island of women, and along with her two sisters, they are seen as the three higher-ups of this civilization. And if Luffy wants to get off this rock, he needs her ship and help, which leads to a funny character moment for Luffy, wherein he climbs to the top of the tallest building because, and I quote, that's where important people are, before falling through the roof into the bath chamber of Hancock, where he gets a glimpse of her back. And I should also explain that no one can see her back due to the apparent presence of a Gorgon's eye that would turn those that do see it to stone immediately. But interestingly, Luffy recognizes it, and it's not a Gorgon's eye. However, in all of this confusion and shock, Hancock tries to turn him to stone, but it has zero effect on Luffy, which is a fun bit of character writing because he doesn't find her attractive at all, unlike literally everyone else in this world apparently. But easily the most interesting and eye-opening part of this arc for me has to be this scene. This changes everything. Haki has been hinted at throughout this series, but what Luffy demonstrated here, shutting down a crowd of people, is something I've only seen with Shanks before. Which leads me down all sorts of interesting rabbit holes that might be worth exploring in predicting the future and recontextualizing the past events of the series. The snake warriors he faces off against in this battle to the death have variations of the Haki power, but in this moment of stress he activates within himself a power that according to Hancock is an incredibly rare power, only seen maybe once in millions of people. This particular power is referred to by them as the Haki of the Supreme King, which, I mean, what? But here's my theory on this. Put on your speculation hats because I'm about to blow the whole lid on this thing. This civilization of women on this island refer to devil fruit abilities as cursed powers. They don't know it, so they have their different terminology for various things. What if the Haki of the Supreme King is actually King of the Pirates? And what if Goldie Roger had this exact same ability or trait that we're not necessarily aware of yet? Regardless, what makes this interesting is that it perhaps gives reason as to why Shanks found himself hanging around Luffy for years and years. Maybe Goldie Roger knew that Luffy would be important to protect. I mean, he's referred to as the future sometimes in this story, but for someone like Shanks to give up his arm to protect him like that is a really interesting move, not just because Luffy could be very important, but also because surely Shanks could have easily taken out that sea monster that did that to his arm. Maybe he knew that this would motivate Luffy to take on the path that he did. Or perhaps Luffy has another power that nullifies the Haki of other users. I mean, it was a stressful incident for him, and I haven't even touched on the likelihood of Haki being used on the blade of someone like Hawkeye. We already learned that Haki can coat the outside of weapons in this story too, but whatever, I'm getting a little lost in the weeds here, so let's move on before I completely dive off the deep end. Despite all of this lore speculation, my favorite aspect of this story is how subtle it is when it comes to informing us of Luffy's current predicament and mindset. Throughout his time in Amazon Lily, he's found himself in various circumstances where he misses individual crew members, not just from a friendship point of view, but also a utilitarian point of view, painting for us a much more solemn picture of Luffy's predicament while also reinforcing the notion that he's only here because of the crew he built around him, using all of their strengths in conjunction with his own to get where they did today. And so while stumbling and bouncing around from place to place in Amazon Lily, he finds himself eating bad food that Sanji could have prevented. He finds himself failing to build a means of sailing away that Frankie could have provided. He realizes that even if he did sail away, he'd have no chance of finding where he needs to go because Nami's navigation is something that he cannot do himself. And even when faced with hurt or injured friends in this story, he makes mention that Chopper would be invaluable in this instance. These are really nice bits of subtle emotional writing that keeps the crew at the forefront of our minds and puts into perspective for us how much they mean for him and the story. And speaking of emotional, this story packed a few of those too. For such a short tale, it does well in establishing characters to care about while hinging it all on our appreciation for Luffy as a character. For instance, the main point of contention in this arc comes as Luffy fights the two Snake sisters after Hancock turned Luffy's friend and the other two tribeswomen to stone after they vouched for him and his good intentions. And so once Luffy wins the fight, while also protecting the marks on their backs from the audience watching, he puts not only the sisters he's fighting in their places, but also puts Hancock in a really difficult situation. As explained within her backstory, she finds it incredibly hard to trust most people, specifically men, which, once we do hear her story, is understandable given what she's gone through. And before I get any comments about it, I know I'm not mentioning Fisher Tiger, there's just too much stuff to go over in this particular instance. Her backstory was really, really interesting, but essentially she and her sisters, as well as thousands of slaves were freed by someone that climbed the red line with his bare hands, and that person was called Fisher Tiger. I have no idea who this person is, and I certainly have no idea what implications he might have for the story moving forward. But in one last effort to expose Luffy as a selfish person concerned with only his own goals, she offers him a dilemma. Either she can take him to where he needs to go to save his brother, or she can return those women who stood up to her on Luffy's behalf back to normal. And after an entire arc of following Luffy experience what it's like to be alone, isolated from his comrades, he chooses without hesitation, and with a relieved smile on his face, for her to save the 3 women. And the very fact that that was such a non-issue for Luffy honestly had me welling up while I was reading. It's a beautiful moment. And it's that very aspect of Luffy's identity that rather ironically causes Hancock to become infatuated with them as a love interest, leading her to stow him away in the naval vessel to facilitate his rescue of Ace in Impel Down.
So tell me, does he give you nice doggy biscuits when he wants you to play fetch?
And you, all bark, no bite.
Woof, woof, woof.
You're not funny.
This is probably the most narratively dense arc in per volumes read, but despite this, it's actually an incredibly simple story filled to bursting with character, compelling team-ups, and a very real sense of tension and dread that builds up until the very end, wherein it meets a very satisfying crescendo. But not the main crescendo, that's next week. But as I said, this arc is incredibly dense and detailed, so in order to protect my sanity, I've decided to split it up into 4 sections. So let's get it. Section 1, getting to Ace. For all intents and purposes, the Impel Down arc of One Piece is a fully realized prison break story, during which Oda, as per the usual, establishes the area by way of maps, careful scene selection, and brute force. And what I mean by brute force is, Luffy ends up causing so much trouble in this damn building that everything gets thrown at him. And of course, those he accumulates to his side during this jailbreak. And trust me, by the time this arc is over, you'll be able to draw a detailed image of this place with 99% accuracy without even popping a reference. Well, maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the point still stands. Stuff goes down in this arc. Literally and figuratively, because they're literally going down. Never mind. And what makes this prison break nigh impossible to pull off are these factors that we've been aware of from the very beginning of the story. It is, much like the Amazon Lily arc, situated on the calm belt surrounded by Neptunians, behind the biggest doors I've ever seen, ever. It's guarded by some of the most powerful and imposing folks in the universe of One Piece. Oh, and did I mention that the entire facility is underwater? You know, water? The thing devil fruit wielders can't find themselves in? Yeah, well, that's all around it, and what's more is that Ace is at the very bottom. And to be honest, all of these mechanics have been understood by us since the very beginning or around therein, but have never been used all in conjunction with one another to create such an impenetrable fortress for Luffy to infiltrate. But maybe my favorite aspect at the beginning is the nature of how Luffy gained entry into Impel Down in the first place. This is, of course, a maximum security prison built to contain some of the most dangerous people in the world. It's never been broken into, and certainly no one has escaped. And I just love this because the only reason Luffy can break into this place successfully is by being a truly good person. He was a truly good person to Hancock, convincing her to escort him by way giving him entrance to the building in the first place. The prison is for dangerous and evil people. Luffy is neither of those things. I love that someone with those qualities created the very first blemish in the facility's history. And once he separates from Hancock, Luffy begins what ends up being one of the most physically taxing, and actually no, scratch that. This is 100% the most physically taxing experience he has ever had to deal with since the story began, discovering that the facility is multi-layered, with each subsequent deeper layer housing more and more dangerous personnel with increasingly harsh qualities. For instance, Level 1 has a forest made entirely of pointy things, while lower levels have, well, pretty much hell, which, you know, not ideal. But as it happens, on his way through all of these floors, he meets quite a few faces from the past to help him in his endeavor. On level 1, Luffy hooks up with, and get this, Buggy the frigging clown, which was so cool to see, and to be honest, it offered a lot in the way of comedy. With this panel having me in stitches while reading, I'll let you be the ones to read that if you want, but I just loved it. And that joke only works now because we understand how small of a player Buggy is in the grand scheme of things. Or is he? And after each subsequent level they reach, more and more faces from the past rear their heads to join his cause, with level 1 and 2 offering up Buggy, as I said, and Mr. 3, if you'll believe it. And it's in these scenes with Luffy, Mr. 3, and Buggy that some of the best comedic moments are on display. Buggy had the intention of only taking Luffy as far as the entrance in exchange for an important armband that Nami gave him, but no matter what Buggy and ultimately Mr. 3 do, they always find themselves unintentionally following Luffy down through the depths deeper and deeper and deeper as Luffy plunges himself further and further into the hellish chambers of this increasingly more dangerous Impel Down, coming face to face with tons of security and Blueberry, not to mention the roaming beasts and the warden of the facility, but more on him later. First we got to see this guy.
Oh, come away!
That's right! It's time for One Piece's best boy, the charming, the beautiful Bon Clay. And to be honest, this section of the story had ingenious uses for Buggy, Mr. 3, and of course, Bon Clay, both comedically and narratively, providing so much entertainment and substance to the overall story, creating along the way a very different and unique team for Luffy to surround himself with, which again only happens because of who Luffy is as a character. Because of who Luffy is, all of these one-time enemies find themselves either having to or wanting to follow his lead, which on its own is a nice touch, but because we've already spent so much time with the established Straw Hat cast, it's a nice change of pace seeing how all of these new powers bounce off each other through the various imposing and intense challenges that Impel Down provides them, with curious moments where Luffy's haki might have even been used a number of times against animals in the building. So much is happening, I don't even know how to contain myself or process it. Oh, and they take down a Minotaur that looks kind of like a cow too. But no battle was more imposing or brutal than Luffy's battle with Warden Magellan on level 4. This fight is hard to watch, and what's weird is that this Warden Magellan seems like a very reasonable and likable character. So given my understanding of this world now, there are good and bad folks on both sides it seems, aside from the world government who seem to be the most shady and corrupt by far. In fact, I'm not even sure I've met anyone from their side that's actually not just a really bad or sketchy individual. The Navy has tons of good characters like Garp and Smoker, but also contains some dangerous people too that I'm unsure of yet. The more I read One Piece, the more it starts to feel like good Game of Thrones, only no one really dies, or maybe I'm speaking too soon, I don't know. The Devil Fruit ability of Magellan happens to be that of poison, and in combat with Luffy, despite his best efforts, leaves him for dead. Which highlights another aspect of One Piece I utterly adore. Luffy loses on a semi-regular basis. Like, he can actually lose in a devastating manner, which just adds so much tension not only to this arc, but the rest of the series and what's to come in the future. Ace's situation. For the most part, Ace hasn't played a massive role in the main story until this saga. Instead, he sort of appeared sporadically throughout the manga during specific key instances wherein he acted as a measuring stick for Luffy, an incredibly flashy character, and a component that served to remind me that all of the characters involved in the story are active during and after their time on screen or in the main narrative. But as soon as Blackbeard apprehended him and turned him in to become a warlord of the sea, Ace has become a much more important character in the story, one that now acts and main goal of the plot. And to be honest, Ace is a character right now I don't really know too much about yet, but what I do love about him is what he means as being a plot device. He is the perfect intersection of all the main parties involved in this epic power struggle for supremacy over the oceans. There's the Navy that have him in shackles and have a vested interest in taking him down. There are the revolutionaries led by his father, Monkey D. Dragon, and of course Whitebeard, whom he worked under for a very long time. And because of him acting as a point of interest for all of these individual parties, it not only serves to be a great motivating factor for the big power players in the story, but also facilitates new pieces of info to be released to us about them, albeit in subtle ways. There's a rather interesting and somewhat illuminating scene between Ace and his grandfather Garp, as Ace himself lies shackled in a maximum security holding cell. In that, Ace reveals that he's both aware of and resents his father, which is interesting as Luffy doesn't seem to hold any grudge and by all accounts doesn't even remember what he looks like. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of this exchange comes when Garp tries to explain to Ace that his father had his reasons, which makes me question Garp's allegiance to the Navy. That's sort of a weird thing for someone in his position to say, I would think. He already shouldn't be where he is talking to Ace, but here we are. It's a really interesting turn of events, and we still have no idea who Luffy and Ace's mother was or is. And all of this serves pretty much to once again bring the situation to the forefront. All the Straw Hats are scattered across the world, and the war seems to be imminent. And what's more is, much later in the story, we learn what other detainees are held alongside Ace. There are 3 of note, and they are Shiryu and Jinbei. Croc, I think it goes without saying, I was already very familiar with, and it's cool to see him again. Apparently he's still very driven, and once he finds out about all the mobilization, he makes it known that he wants to kill Whitebeard too. Shiryu, on the other hand, is a new character who is described as being a savage one-time jailer that worked in Impel Down once upon a time but was thrown in this cell for being far too ruthless, which is interesting, I think. And the final character I mentioned was Jinbei, the final warlord of the sea that we have not seen yet, that is also a fisherman that respects Whitebeard for bringing peace to his people. He seems very interesting to me, and he too wants peace. And with that, he even acknowledges shortcomings within his own civilization of people. And later on in the story, apologizes on behalf of Arlong, which is honestly kind of crazy to think about. And combining that with the fact that the Whitebeard pirates are making a move on the Navy, Kaido, another emperor of the sea, is making moves to take out Whitebeard, and while this is all happening, Shanks is trying to stop Kaido. I still don't know what Shanks' goal is here besides trying to maintain peace. Is there a reason why he's trying to maintain peace? I wonder if he might have more skin in the game than we might realize. But yeah, there are tons of things to consider going on in the wider world that aren't yet connecting to the immediate story, so I thought I'd throw them all into this section so that I wouldn't get bogged down in the details later on. I can't wait for all of this to go down. Something big is definitely happening. Luffy's recovery. This segment acts as the lull right before we head for the big climax, and I honestly find it to be very cool. Pun intended. One of the motivating factors Bon Clay was working towards alongside Luffy was the release of a particular character he called Eva, a so-called miracle worker. His words, not mine. However, in an act of tremendous selflessness, Bon Clay carries the poisoned Luffy moments from death in an effort to find a cure to his terminal situation, despite Mr. 3 and Buggy after running away and deserting them both. Eventually, he loses consciousness himself in the middle of a snowy wilderness despite the power of Luffy keeping some wolves away in a very curious way. I guess that's his hacky power once again, he's getting better at that. But once Mr. Bon Clay awakes, we are introduced to a new area within the prison wherein a vast variety of freedom fighters and former prisoners find themselves, after creating a small civilization within these self-made crawl spaces between floors 5 and 6 of Impel Down. There, Bon meets Eva, the person who saved them and put Luffy into a potentially survivable state. But what makes this all the more interesting is that throughout the entire time we've been in Impel Down, every few chapters we are reminded of the dwindling time before Ace's impending execution, acting as a countdown of sorts for us the reader, which also creates its own tension and sense of urgency to add to the occasion. But by far the most compelling part of this section comes during the window of time within which Luffy's body is in agony fighting off the effects of the poison. For hours and hours on end, he is screaming in unbelievable pain. But despite doing so all through the night, Bon Clay stays with him outside his door, cheering on his efforts to beat this thing for 20 hours, despite Bon Clay at the time thinking and believing that Luffy only had a 2% chance at the time of survival. But in typical Luffy fashion, he beats the poison in record time, devours an absurd amount of food, and is ready to go. Well, not really. This emergency treatment required Luffy to take 10 years off of his life, which just makes me all sorts of anxious. And even after expelling all the poison from his body and eating an ungodly amount of food, he still is incredibly fatigued. However, once again, thankfully, Eva increased adrenaline. Only once it wears off in 24 hours, he will crash hard. So, looking forward to that. But I think the takeaway from this scene is just how much of an awesome character and all-around great guy Bon Clay is. But anyway, bottom line, get Ace out, we still have some time.
Luffy, 止まるな。さっさと歩け。
Okay, they are too late. Ace is already being escorted out of the building. Getting out again. This section is my favorite part of the story and is by far and away the most dense. And I think of the many aspects working in this section's favor that works perhaps the best is that there are so many mini stories after being established. And once established, as an audience, we wait to see how the story progresses with these and interweaves them into the narrative. However, despite arriving too late to spring his brother from prison, he still has the chance to grab him before they take him to Marineford. But they need muscle. They need more help than what they currently have in order to even get out of this underwater bunker alone. However, thankfully, the area they find themselves within isn't exactly short of talent. I can't tell you how cool it was watching Croc fight alongside Luffy. And I friggin' love how nonchalant he is pretty much about everything he does. Also, where does he get these cigars? Never mind. And while the epic action is happening with Team Luffy as they barge their way through the various floors in the compound, Shiryu, the dangerous and corrupt jailer from before, gets the attention of one of the officers in the prison and convinces them to let him go, to let him help them to regain control of the facility. Naturally, they oblige, but okay. This bit is brilliant. So, you know the way Bon Clay and Luffy had their own little troubles to deal with for the last 20 some odd hours? Well, in typical Oda fashion, both Mr. 3 and Buggy had their very own little adventure off screen where they managed to sneak up to floor 2 using their combined powers and teamwork. And while on their way through the various levels, they had been freeing prisoners in an attempt to cause enough of a distraction to escape themselves. However, as they continue to free prisoners, Buggy manages to accumulate a massive following, which again is just super funny. And this is where something super interesting happens. So, as it happens, despite all the warlords supposedly being ordered to be at Marineford, Blackbeard is missing when suddenly, as Luffy is holding off and trying to defeat one of the officers of the prison on level 4, out of nowhere cuts in Blackbeard, wiping everyone out. Blackbeard pretty much fills Luffy in on what he's done to his brother, causing Luffy to land a massive hit on the pirate, leading Blackbeard to remark that he's stronger than he thought and that his haki is stronger than it was last time too. Which means that Blackbeard can sense haki and the strength of its users despite folks like Hancock being taken aback when Luffy demonstrated his haki power. This is interesting. But what makes this interesting to me is that becoming a warlord of the sea was important to Blackbeard before, yet coming here I would think means that he forfeits that title. So why is it okay or important to forfeit the title in this instance? Perhaps it's something warlords are privy to that others aren't, maybe, that he already saw and doesn't need to see anymore. Shiryu seems to be also in on it too. I mean, he did let Blackbeard slip right by him at the top floor. Regardless, something big is happening here and Blackbeard says as much, stating that in a few hours they are going to, and I quote, put on a show that will shake the world. And with that, he walks past the young pirate. He is not after Luffy in this instance. I have no idea what he's doing, but I am interested. As the story progresses through some amazing teamwork combining the powers of the Wax Wax Fruit with Luffy's abilities for both defensive and offensive purposes, it created a stunning action sequence and a fantastic redemption moment for Mr. 3. But all is still not well, as despite reaching the top of Impel Down, and even after Jinbei uses his abilities to get them into the ship, they still have no means of escape, as once again, the massive gate won't open unless switched open from within the facility. This story, man, that's right. Bon Clay, the absolute mad lad, saves the friggin' day again by being just an absolute genius and a selfless person. I really can't undersell just how ridiculously fun this climax was. From the teamwork to the commandeering of ships to even whale sharks summoned by Jinbei. All the while having to think in the back of our heads that Blackbeard is after being taken out by this poison guy, which apparently is okay to him. What? And also the poison Magellan guy is on his way up to stop them in their tracks before they leave there and then now. It was a stunning masterclass in writing, ending with a very bittersweet finish as Bon Clay sacrifices himself to let them run free. And that's when we see this. There's not much time left. You know, before I started reading One Piece, I mentioned that one of the only aspects of the story that I knew about before diving in was the One Piece treasure itself. And like many of you, I would imagine, I was incredibly worried that the treasure would be something like the friends they made along the way or something. But given the journey we've been on with the characters in this series, I almost wouldn't mind if it was. And that's how good Oda is. His story is so good, I actually feel like he's earned the ending of "the friends they made along the way was the treasure." And I can already hear you typing down below, "I know that isn't the One Piece treasure itself, I'm just saying." I'm very aware that Oda cleared that up himself a long time ago. But more importantly, this arc was not only a stellar adventure driven by emotion and tension unlike any I've ever read before, but it very much also served as a platform for Oda to show us all how ridiculously meticulous and careful with his storytelling he can be, and often is. With very few plot points, encounters, and reveals happening just because Oda thought it looked cool, and even less are unearned. And with this adventure through Amazon Lily and Impel Down, two story arcs that hinge heavily on our emotional connection to the Straw Hats and our dedication in keeping up with the secondary story threads, in the hands of a lesser or even standard storyteller, the events I discussed in this video would not only have felt contrived, but also boring and lifeless. It's difficult to try to convey just how impossible these sort of arcs are or should have been to pull off, with 90% of the main cast literally absent, and with the vast majority of encounters depending on the reader's dedication or willingness to accept new characters into the fold. Amazon Lily and Impel Down stand for me as monuments to the best manga story I've ever in my life read through. As some of you who follow me on Twitter might already know, I've been going at this whole YouTube thing pretty hard for the last 2 years straight. And while I love reading and writing for these One Piece videos, I think after my video next week, I'll need to take a break for a week or two. Nothing too long, just to recharge my batteries. I hope YouTube doesn't banish my channel into obscurity because of that, but if it does, it would really mean a lot to me if you subscribed and hit the bell notification to make sure that didn't happen. And if you'd still like to hear from me or ask me any questions, I'll still be on Twitter during that break too. My Twitter handle is @TotallyNotMark. However, next week, as I said, I'll be tackling the big finish to the arc, Marineford. Excited doesn't begin to describe how pumped I am to see how this saga unfolds and concludes, and Lord knows I'm not ready emotionally, as so many of you have warned me about. But my hope is that once again, you can join me on this adventure. Well, that'll do it for this video. As always, I've been Totally Not Mark. I'll see you all next week, and thank you so much for watching.
My guess is that earthquakes are really so scary because you don't have any warning. It's the only thing besides a nuclear war that can really, 1 second you're living in a big beautiful city and 10 seconds later it's flat.